Have you ever interacted with somebody and maybe used a word that isn't common in everyday speech, only for that individual to react negatively and call you pretentious? Maybe they say something like, "Why would you use that word when you could just use this more common phrase?" Well, being a logophile is not always easy, especially when the surrounding environment can sometimes be antagonistic towards vocabulary expansion. In this video, I actually want to examine why I think this reaction is often misguided, not because people are wrong for preferring simpler language, but because they sometimes make unjustified leaps from someone's vocabulary choice to assumptions about their character, intentions, or motivations. So right now, let's go over a couple of scenarios and break them down. Say someone says to you, after hearing you use a few uncommon words, whether it be in speech or writing, and they say, "Why use the word rapacious or avaricious when you could just say greedy? Why use the word deleterious when you could just say harmful?" Now, in this scenario, it's entirely possible that the person is simply just curious about your word choice. They may not be making any judgment whatsoever. And honestly, this is a perfectly reasonable question. The way I have come to answer this kind of question is to say that words are not merely vehicles for transferring information from one person to another. They are also a medium of expression for the individual using them. Language has both a communicative function and an expressive function, and sometimes two words may share similar definitions but carry different connotations, emotional associations, historical backgrounds, or just aesthetic qualities that people like. So choosing one word over another can sometimes be a matter of precision, style, tone, or just simply personal preference. Now, this is how I would respond to a question like that. And the best case scenario is that they say, "Oh, that makes sense," and the conversation continues on as normal. But what happens when somebody is not neutral about your vocabulary choice? What happens when they begin attributing intentions behind the words that you use? This brings us to scenario 2. Okay, so now say someone asks the very same question as scenario 1, but they tack on an additional premise. They say, "Why would I use X word instead of Y word? I don't need some fancy $7 word when I already have a word in my vocabulary that means the same thing." Now, I want to be clear. I actually think this position can be completely reasonable if it is expressed as a personal vocabulary preference. Someone might prefer simplicity, accessibility, and conversational efficiency. There is nothing wrong with that. However, the problem begins when personal preference becomes universalized into a rule about how everyone else ought to use the language. Because the reality is that the words we use to describe the world are shaped by our environment, culture, education, and communities. If someone grew up regularly encountering the word mendacity instead of deceptiveness, they would likely not perceive mendacity as some artificially elevated or pretentious word. It would simply be another word in their vocabulary, and this reveals something important, is that the categories of big words or advanced words or elevated words are often misleading. Rare does not mean superior, uncommon does not mean intellectually advanced, and a word being unfamiliar to someone does not automatically make it more sophisticated. Take our previous example, mendacity and deceptiveness both communicate the idea of dishonesty or deceit. In fact, mendacity is actually shorter in character length and contains the same number of syllables, so it is not necessarily bigger or fancier, it's just another word. Now let's take a look at a real-life example that actually inspired this video. So I was participating in a discussion about whether materialist metaphysics could actually give accounts for things like free will and normativity. A third party observing the conversation responded with this message, to which I responded with this message. Now, I want to be fair here. After reflecting on my original response, I think there were areas where I definitely could have communicated better. For example, I actually framed pretentiousness too narrowly and assumed too much about what the person meant. That was a big mistake on my part, and I apologize. If I could redo my response, I would simply ask, what specific words are you referring to, and why do you think they are unnecessary? Because that question gets us closer to the actual issue. The reason I bring up this interaction is because I think there is genuinely a deeper philosophical problem that underlies it. The issue is not whether uncommon words exist, of course they do. The issue is whether vocabulary alone gives us enough evidence to determine someone's intentions. And I would even step a bit further and say that this is primarily an individual's attitudinal issue, because I even received this comment under one of my videos on my Instagram page. And I'll be honest with you, I was flabbergasted when I read this because I've never seen those words before. Onanism, bagatelles, involution. I was like, wow, he's spin. But never once did it cross my mind that this person was trying to get the intellectual one-up on me. Not once did I think to myself, oh, this guy's just trying to be a pretentious know-it-all using all these big words when he could just simply say this. No, when I read that message, I thought to myself, wow, I just learned 3 new words, and that's awesome. Someone using an uncommon word or phrase could be trying to impress others, sure. Or maybe they're just attempting to communicate with greater precision, or perhaps they're matching an academic register. Or how about expressing themselves stylistically? Or maybe they're just simply using the vocabulary they naturally possess. The observable fact is the word choice they use. But the inferred conclusion is that person's motivations and intentions, and those are not the same thing. Now, I'm not saying pretentiousness doesn't exist. People can absolutely misuse technical terminology, obscure simple ideas unnecessarily, or use complexity as a substitute for substance. That phenomena is real, and it exists. And when someone intentionally cultivates the appearance of sophistication without the corresponding understanding, calling it pretentious may be an entirely appropriate criticism. What I'm attempting to highlight is that pretentiousness arises from the user of language and not from the language itself. There are no pretentious words, only people who behave pretentiously. But the mistake is in assuming that every use of uncommon words is an example of that phenomenon. A scientist using photosynthesis instead of saying plants turning sunlight into energy is not being pretentious. A mathematician using the word derivative instead of explaining the entire concept every single time is not being pretentious. Every discipline develops specialized vocabulary to create precision, and philosophy is no different. Linguists actually refer to these differences as registers. The vocabulary appropriate in an academic seminar differs from the vocabulary appropriate at a family dinner. And neither register is inherently superior to another, nor are these registers necessarily putting strict boundaries on what language ought to be used and when it ought to be used. It's just another way to understand language's contextual applications. And this brings me to my final point. One of the problems with calling someone pretentious is that the accusation often attempts to identify a person's internal state from their external behavior alone. Sometimes those inferences are justified, sometimes they are not. The question is whether the available evidence actually warrants the conclusion. Intentions are not directly observable. They require interpretation, and interpretation requires evidence. Now, I'm not saying one's vocabulary doesn't count as evidence nor contribute to an overall assessment of someone's intentions, but on its own, it rarely provides sufficient evidence to justify a confident conclusion. Someone using an uncommon word could be trying to impress others. Yes, we've established that. They could also be communicating with greater precision, or perhaps matching a register of an academic discussion, or simply expressing themselves stylistically, or maybe they're just speaking the way they always have spoken. What I'm trying to say here is that the observable behavior is compatible with many different motivations, and sometimes this unfamiliar word choice means they've just found a word that best captures what they've been trying to convey. Or maybe they're just tired of using the same couple words to express their ideas and want to switch it up. Now, if simplicity is your preferred rhetorical style, that is perfectly valid. If you value plain language, accessibility, and clarity, those are all excellent linguistic virtues. But as we investigate further into the many underlying philosophical disagreements in language usage, we usually arrive at a difference of values. Philosophers actually refer to theories about what ought to be valued as an axiology. In this case, the disagreement concerns what we value most in our language. Some people prioritize clarity and accessibility above all else. Others also value expressiveness, precision, rhythm, or just aesthetic style. The issue arises when one person takes their axiology about language and attempts to universalize it. I'm sorry if it sounds like I'm repeating myself, but the idea is if you value language's communicative function over its expressive function, that's all well and good. But that axiological hierarchy is not an objective one, nor is it universally shared. Okay, but one might object and say, fine, but why not always just choose the simpler synonym? We can combat this objection with 2 reasons. One is that near synonyms rarely mean the exact same thing. They carry different connotations, historical usages, emotional forces, and levels of precision. And 2, as stated before, language can also be used as an individual's creative outlet, and they may value the expressive function of language over the communicative one. Now, if you made it this far in the video, I just want to say thank you so very much. I really do hope this video was informative and you found it both educational and edifying. One of the reasons this topic matters so much to me is because that my long-term academic aspiration is to become a virtue epistemologist. And virtue epistemology studies the intellectual character traits that help us form true beliefs about the world or just make us better inquirers in general. And one of those virtues is intellectual humility, because intellectual humility requires us to distinguish between what we observe and what we infer. We observe vocabulary, we infer intentions. Those two things should never be confused. So, before concluding that someone is pretentious, we should always first ask ourselves whether the available evidence actually warrants the conclusions we're making about it. In philosophy, as in everyday life, our conclusions should never outrun our evidence. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Hey everybody, thanks again so much for watching. This portion of the video is candid and unscripted, and I just wanted to let you guys know that I'm also on Instagram. And on Instagram, what I do is it's a taxonomy page. So I just go over key terms that you'd find in philosophy. I define them, maybe give a quote for a couple of key thinkers, and how they go about the practice and so on and so forth. So yeah, I know this is less coherent than my big scripted portion, but I just wanted to let you guys know that I'm over there, and if you enjoy content like this, you can find me on Instagram, and stay tuned for more. So thank you so much, and I'll catch ya.